Listen-only mode.
Welcome everyone. I'm Kelly McFarland, your facilitator for today's webinar. This webinar is organized by Swords to Plowshares and was originally designed for grantees of the California Women Veteran Project to gain a cultural understanding of the women veterans they have served in their respective projects, as well as stay informed of emerging issues. This webinar will explore some of the challenges common to the experience of women veterans and their interaction with public support in the legal system in California. There are many points where a woman veteran may interact with the legal system, such as family court and criminal court. There are also many instances where a woman veteran may need legal support or assistance. Our panelists will identify some major points of interaction and where the need for support is greatest. Cecilia Kim is a senior staff attorney at the California Women's Law Center. She litigates a broad range of issues addressing systemic discrimination against women and girls, including federal class action lawsuits seeking equal access to education. Cecilia also works with national and state legal advocacy organizations to develop and influence legislation that supports and protects working families, and has written policy briefs and legal resource guides concerning a broad range of legal issues, including the legal rights of pregnant students and women veterans. Elizabeth Kristen is the director of the Gender Equity and LGBT Rights Program and a senior staff attorney at Legal Aid Society Employment Law Center. Legal Aid's Gender Equity and LGBT Rights Program is dedicated to promoting gender equity and advancing the rights of low-wage women and families, lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender individuals, survivors of domestic and sexual violence, pregnant women, caregivers, military families and veterans, and other underrepresented workers and students. During this webinar, you may type a question to the panelists or Swords to Plowshares staff at any time. Simply type your question in the questions box on the right side of your webinar's display. At the end of the presentation, we will review the questions and comments posted. All participants will be given a chance to ask a question of Elizabeth or Cecilia by raising your virtual hand. Simply click on the small hand icon under the list of attendees next to your name. Please note this webinar is being recorded and will be archived on the Swords to Plowshares website. Without further delay, please welcome our first panelist, Cecilia Kim. We have been experiencing some technical difficulties this morning, and we hope that Cecilia is with us. Cecilia? We apologize for this delay, folks. Stay with us. We'll have it solved shortly.
Kelly, can you hear me?
Yes, now we can hear you.
Okay, so should I go forward?
Yes.
Okay. Sorry about that, everyone. Good morning, everyone. I was just talking to myself here. I wanted to thank you for joining us this morning, and thanks to Swords to Plowshares for giving us an opportunity to talk about the California Women Veterans Legal Collaborative. And this is a partnership between Legal Aid Society Employment Law Center and the California Women's Law Center. About a year or two ago, both of our organizations began getting involved with legal issues concerning homeless women veterans. And we quickly learned that this population has diverse legal needs. We also quickly discovered that a common factor among many of the homeless women is that they were sexually assaulted while they were in their military. And many of their legal problems were related to or stemmed from this very traumatic event. So luckily, we were able to get a grant from Source to Plowshare and really formalize and build up a program significantly targeting this population. Our goal has been to provide a statewide legal assistance program with a focus on veterans with a history of military sexual trauma. And we tried to do this in a couple of different ways. We provide direct legal services to women veterans and have done so down here, up north where Elizabeth is located, and in Central California as well. We also do trainings for advocates, particularly legal advocates and judges as well, about the emerging issues regarding legal issues regarding women veterans. And we also do a lot of community outreach and presentations at conferences as well. So I'm going to give you an overview of what I'm going to be discussing today. Just a brief overview about who are military and women veterans, and then focus on some trouble spots. And these are some of the spots, legal cases that Elizabeth and I have been working on in the past year. So I'm going to go over the mistrust of the court system and its impact on legal assistance to women veterans. We're going to talk about unconscionable discharges. These are service members who are deemed medically unfit for duty after they've been sexually assaulted. Barriers to disability benefits, which I'm sure many of you have already heard about. Barriers to veteran housing. And then also focus on the multiple employment issues. That's been the surprise this past year, is that women veterans have a lot of employment issues, and in various contexts. So wanted to really focus on that as well, and Elizabeth will be presenting that in the second half of this presentation. So quickly going over some historical perspective, there's been a lot of formal systemic discrimination in the armed forces. When I first started looking into women veterans, I didn't really know the level of discrimination in the military. Because, you know, and so we brought together a focus group of women veterans to talk about this issue. Because my understanding was, hey, there's gender discrimination in the civilian context too. That's what I do as, you know, a profession. But it was really eye-opening to listen to the stories of the different women veterans and just the level of systemic discrimination that women have in the military. A lot more before, but it's still there. And it's blatant, it's open, it's condoned, it's pervasive. So it's not just the military, but it's in the family policies, the military academies, the combat exclusions, you know, all of this stuff. And it's every day for many of the women, depending on what you did in the military, particularly if you were in a area where there weren't a lot of other women. And then I think, you know, the recent media with all the culture of sexual harassment and assault in the military, we've seen the DOD reports and the incredible numbers of assaults. It's just actually a fraction of how many was actually happening, because they said 90% of sexual assault victims don't even report. And also discrimination in related institutions like the VA. So it doesn't stop just in the military, but it also, you know, the culture and the discrimination of women and the unfair treatment actually pervades into institutions like the VA. It's not to the same extent, but there are still a lot of problems. It's interesting that I was talking to someone at the VA, a female veteran who works there. She says she does not tell other workers or, you know, clients at the VA that she is a female veteran, because she feels that at the VA that women veterans are treated differently than other women. And so she keeps that to herself. So unlike what many of us in the civilian world believe, women didn't just recently join the military. They have served in every military campaign from the very beginning. And so some interesting pictures of different women veterans throughout the different campaigns. So here's women in the Civil War, World War I, World War II. And then we get to women veterans today. How many women veterans are there? And I'm sorry, I have female veterans, and I just learned from the Source to Plowshare meetings that we had for Southern California that we should all be using the term women veterans, and this kind of snuck into my slide here. So there are 14% of the current active duty military force, 10% of the current veteran population. There's over 2.2 million women veterans total. By 2036, we're going to have 15.2% of the veteran population will be women. And what are female veterans like? The average age is 48 compared to 63 for male veterans, so they're a lot younger. And disproportionately minority when they're compared to the civilian population and to male veterans. There is also a subgroup that is particularly vulnerable, and I want to emphasize because I have gone to different conferences, and I think a lot of women veterans have been, they don't like the fact that all women veterans are painted as so vulnerable. And so this is a particular subgroup, not all women veterans, but there is a subgroup of women in the military that really have had an extensive history of violence, both before, during, and after military service. So there is a subgroup there where 20 to 48% experience sexual violence during the military. And again, it depends on which, academic study or which, institution is giving the numbers, but it's about 20 to about almost a half. 27 to 49% also experience sexual abuse during childhood. So even before the military, they had this background. And rates of post-service sexual assault significantly higher than the general population. There's also approximately 19% report physical or sexual abuse by an intimate partner. So huge issue with domestic violence. And then this is the VA's, standard proportion, which is 1 in 5 women seen by the VA. So those who get health care treatment from the VA experience military sexual trauma. So we are going to go for our first poll. We would like to know, have you worked with any women veterans who are impacted by the legal system? So I guess I'll pass that over to you, Kelly.
Thank you very much, Cecilia. So if everybody can see on their screen here, they have a quick poll where we have a question of have you worked with any women veterans who have been impacted by the legal system? You can choose yes, no, or not sure. And we can kind of talk a little bit about that, Cecilia, what you kind of expect or what you've seen in the past as results of this. Then we can discuss the results when they come in. And we've got a few folks answering not sure. So far, folks are coming in with split between 71% yes and 29% not so sure. So this is kind of interesting, Cecilia. Are these numbers something you would expect to see, is this traditionally the numbers that you've seen?
Yeah, and it depends on who we're talking about. I think we've got a pretty, we've got Source to Plowshare grantees here. So a lot of them you would expect already deal with women veterans and probably know to ask about legal issues, but it's very different if you have like an attorney group. We did recently did a legal training down in San Diego, and San Diego has a lot of veterans, and a lot of the attorneys did not know that women, never asked about the veteran status, did not know if they had women veterans as their clients, and that's also the case in rural areas too. We have been talking to a lot of organizations in rural areas that reach out to veterans and other low-income homeless populations. And that wasn't just, for a lot of them, that wasn't on their radar. And that's also because they don't ask, are you a veteran, or did you serve in the military?
It's following suit with what you said, Cecilia. Here it looks like we have 60% of the folks attending today's webinar have worked with women who were impacted by the legal system or on the legal system. 10% said no, and 30% indicated that they weren't sure. In other words, it's not something that would come across their question and answer process. Although, if anybody out there has a question with regard to this, and is it important to ask whether one of their clients has had impacted by the legal system, that might be a good, you've certainly got the right people on the webinar today to ask those questions about how you might gather that info. Thank you very much, Cecilia.
Okay, so let's move on. So I'm going to talk about some of the legal trouble spots that Elizabeth and I have been working on in the past year. So I wanted to start with distrust for the military system and supporting structures. One of the big consequences of experiencing such blatant ongoing gender discrimination and unequal treatment over and over again, not only in the military, but also when you come out and deal with related institutions like the VA, is that you develop this deep mistrust of different institutions, and you feel that you can't get any justice. And this is particularly true for service members who are assaulted in the military, really treated unconscionably when they try to report it. And we'll discuss the case shortly on that, but really have lost faith in a lot of the different institutions that they have to deal with. But this really impacts your interaction with the legal system because many of the women veterans or the homeless vets particularly perceive the court system as related to the military system. So they see that as one woman veteran said in one of our focus groups, this is all the same system, it's the same old boys network, they're not going to give me a fair shot, it will be just like in the military, I'll report something and I won't be believed. And this is coming from a veteran who had a very small criminal legal matter that she never took care of, and it just ballooned. And when I asked her, well, why didn't you just seek help, or why didn't you do this? This was her response that, this is all the same system. And she had been in multiple systems, so she had been in the military and had been poorly treated. She had been in the VA, was not able to get health care. She had some family law issues. So she had run into several of these different institutions and just, decided that she would did not trust anybody and gave up on the system. So going on a case spotlight, this is actually how the California Women's Law Center, we became involved in women veteran issues, was when a vet came with multiple traffic citations. So these were moving violations over the years that were never resolved. And so she had multiple bench warrants that were out for her arrest on these. And suspended license. This had a huge impact on her job, on trying to get employed, and other areas of her life. And I think we're getting more knowledge about this. I think this whole issue about traffic citations or very small criminal matters really becoming a stumbling block, particularly for homeless vets who are trying to get back on their feet. So, so when I first, when she first came for help, I just thought, wow, there's no excuse for this. I mean, how irresponsible to simply ignore a court hearing. And that wasn't just once, it was multiple times. And that's because I really didn't understand the issue, and I think a lot of judges at first glance don't understand it either. But once we sat down and talked about it, what was the issue? So I spoke with the vet, pulled her file of the multiple bench warrants, also visited the traffic court, and it became clear what the issue was. And it wasn't because she was just ignoring the court or, that she didn't care or that she was being irresponsible. What was happening was that, she was a veteran, had PTSD for MST. And if you've ever been to the traffic court, it is very big and confusing. If you've ever been to the one that she had to go to, which is Los Angeles, the Metropolitan Courthouse, it's just steaming, kind of a lot of people, a lot of noise. A lot of the bailiffs conduct the traffic courts almost like jail. You're kind of lined up. Everyone has to sit down. There's about over 100 people in a room. And so that was her experience. And when I actually looked on her case, it wasn't that she just ignored these hearing dates either. She had tried to go there about 6 or 7 times to resolve these issues and never could. And actually never stepped into that courthouse. At the courtroom. She made it all the way up there, but once she said once, she saw the judge, and it was like this male judge up there, he looked very stern, just didn't believe that she would get a fair shot and decided to go. But she was also confused about the process, and it is a very confusing process if you're trying to resolve multiple and older traffic tickets. So what we did was we sat down and, was able to speak to the judge, was able to work out a plan, able to dismiss her tickets because it was connected to her military service. So it's not just because you're a vet, you get a free pass and you get all your traffic tickets are excused. But there is case law that says, you know what, if it's connected to your military service, it can be a very important mitigating factor, and judges should know about that. So her mitigating factor was that she is a vet, she has PTSD. That environment was very, very difficult for her to be in. Also, she had this very deep mistrust of the military, and she tried to resolve this, but she just didn't feel that she had a fair shot. And also the fact that, she had this MST, and there's no way that she's going to say in front of a courtroom full of 100 people what was wrong and all the problems that she had, and why she couldn't, she didn't or couldn't resolve these tickets in a timely manner. Okay, so we also worked on discharges for personality and adjustment disorders. So for the last few years, there has been a media spotlight on the military's wrongful diagnoses and discharge of service members on the basis of an alleged personality disorder, particularly in cases of service members who were sexually assaulted. So basically you're saying they're medically unfit for duty. And these are considered pre-existing conditions. So a personality disorder is considered a pre-existing condition. So that means it really bars or limits your access to benefits later on, employment opportunities, and hearings. Imagine, a lot of these documents are accessible by court and potentially employers. And if you have on your record that you were dismissed or discharged from the military because you have some pervasive personality disorder, will likely impact a lot of your future life. So we have a case spotlight. Basically, we had an airman who was sexually assaulted while he was serving in the military, and he reported it. And this is a very young kid, 19 when it happened, and happened soon after he started his service in the military, which often happens for these military sexual assault cases. After that happens, he then seeks mental health therapy with the military doctors to deal with some of this emotional trauma after the assault. And he had basically 3 doctors. He had a main kind of therapy doctor, a psychologist, a psychiatrist, and then another psychologist who provided group therapy. And his main therapist, all of them, they knew that he was recently sexually assaulted. But even so, they decided to give him a personality test, which I think is really egregious. And if there's any mental health professionals on the call today, would love to hear about what the professional protocol is on that. But I can only imagine if we did this in the civilian context and we gave a personality test to a rape victim after the assault and claimed that, hey, this is your kind of a stable personality. Personality test should be done when things are normal, when you're calm, not after a traumatic event. And his main therapist drew up this document that was used against him, basically saying very inflammatory statements about his mental, health, and there was a lot of factual errors in it. And so she diagnosed him with a schizotypal personality disorder and PTSD. So she said there's PTSD from the sexual assault, but there's also this personality disorder, which is actually, this type of personality disorder is very rare. And all of his mental health providers, so his psychiatrist and the group therapy psychologist also said they agreed with this report. So you could just imagine how this airman is feeling, the mistrust and the betrayal, so that he sought help from these mental health professionals. Then these mental health professionals turn around and say, oh, based on what he provided in these therapy sessions, he's unfit mentally to continue in the service. They started a proceeding to medically discharge him. And one of their issues was that they said, okay, we acknowledge that he has PTSD. And PTSD can be treated, right? There's a lot of service members who have PTSD but are still in the service. But in this case, what they said is, yes, we acknowledge he has PTSD from the sexual assault, but his personality disorder is so pervasive that it renders the PTSD untreatable. So you can't treat his PTSD, and that's why he should be discharged from the military. We actually got an independent psychiatrist from UCSF to reassess and give a mental health assessment of the airman. And basically what the psychiatrist found was that he said the symptoms that the military doctors were pointing to as a personality disorder was actually better accounted for under a PTSD diagnosis. So basically what they're pointing to as personality disorder are, the independent psychiatrist said, that's actually all really symptoms of the same thing, this PTSD based on the sexual assault. We still actually lost at the formal physical evaluation board, even though the legal standards are very favorable to the service member here. The standards basically preponderance of the evidence. So basically, more likely than not, that the service member is fit to serve. Also, there's a lot of other provisions that are very favorable to the service member, like any unresolved doubts. If there's any unresolved doubt, like perhaps an independent psychiatric evaluation that says you have PTSD and not a personality disorder, is resolved in favor of fitness for the service member. And so we have appealed that case. That case has still been ongoing, and it's been about 8 months. But what's clear is that this process is very unconscionable. It's very unfair to the service member. Basically ruins your career once you report it. And it's had a significant heavy toll on the mental health of the service member. During this whole time and during this process, not only you were sexually assaulted, but now you've been medically aborted, which is a very stressful process. And they're saying, you've got all these people saying that you're unfit to stay in the military. Your career is in limbo as they try to figure out this process, and there's no access to therapy really because, our service member didn't really want to talk to his mental health providers anymore and get therapy even though he needed it because he felt like, well, I can't trust them. Everything I say to them, they'll be writing down and it'll be used against me in this fitness hearing. So it's a really difficult situation to be in. And there really needs to be some policy changes here because it's really unfair. It's almost a losing battle for service members. And it's so, when they say 90% of service members who've been sexually assaulted never reported, we can see why. I mean, there really is these significant detriments to doing that. Move on here. I'm sure a lot of you have already heard another, really there's a higher bar for disability benefits based on military sexual trauma. So this is another way that women veterans are negatively impacted. So basically under the rules right now, although there is legislation to try to change this, so if you have PTSD and you are seeking disability benefits based on your PTSD once you come out of service, if it is based on combat, your personal testimony is sufficient. But if it is based on military sexual trauma, your personal testimony is not sufficient and you have to have corroborating evidence. Now they have really, broadened the definition of what counts as corroborating evidence, but still there is a different standard. It's a higher evidentiary bar for service members who have PTSD and are disabled because of MSD from combat, because the most difficult part is, just like in combat, is to prove the in-stressor happened during your military service, so that you were assaulted during your military service. And we've been working with a couple of women veterans who have been denied disability benefits based on PTSD before MST. And even though the law has been changed, and they said you can provide corroborating evidence like statements from witnesses and family members about, change in behavior. That really hasn't flown all the way down to some of the, at the level when they're rejecting these disability claims. And there was recently a very helpful court case that came out from the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit, AZ versus Shinseki in 2013. And basically what it said is, you can't use, the fact that there is no proof or there's no document of a sexual assault in their military record, you can't use that against them to deny them disability benefits. So it's changing, and the VA is making policy changes as well, but it's still on the ground. Women veterans are disproportionately denied these disability benefits if it's based on military sexual trauma. So they see that as another, this is another instance where they are not treated fairly as men. Legal barriers to housing as well. Disproportionate homeless rate among women veterans. It's high among male veterans too, but disproportionately higher for women, and women are increasing at a faster rate than men. And current housing for veterans fail to accommodate the needs of women veterans, particularly those with MST or for family members. There's a lack of accommodations. I think like 60% of the transitional housing facilities don't even allow kids. And of course, women are disproportionately the ones who, women veterans are disproportionately the ones who actually have are single parents and have custody of children. I think it was like 11% to 4% of male veterans. So this is a huge area. This has been getting a lot of attention. More attention is still needed to that. And wanted to do a case spotlight on a case we're currently working on. And this is in the context of veteran-only housing. So non-housing where veterans have a HUD-dash voucher and could go out into the civilian housing world and get housing anywhere. But we're talking about these special veteran-only housing where only veterans, and usually with some kind of disability, are in these housing complexes. The problem is, given the disproportionate number of men in these facilities, you're going to have pretty much, a few women veterans surrounded by male veterans. And their lack of reasonable, these housing facilities do not provide reasonable accommodations for women who have a disability based on PTSD due to military sexual trauma. So that is safety precautions, better safety precautions, but also sex-segregated accommodations, whether it's separate floors or wings just for women. But what we've heard from a lot of women veterans is that, I'm not going to go into that facility, particularly when I have, a history of a military sexual trauma. I don't feel safe in there, and I don't want to live in a facility where I'm surrounded by men. There's also a lack of proper training and supervision for staff that currently run these facilities as well. There have been different reports, OIG reports, of women veterans being assaulted in these transitional housing facilities from the staff as well. So we are actually working on a case right now, and actually if anybody knows of women veterans who currently have decided not to go in these veteran-only facilities or have tried it and decided I just can't, stay in this facility, would really love to hear from you about it. Okay, so I think we're going to go on to our second poll. And our second poll is basically, if you've worked with women veterans impacted by the legal system, what kind of legal issues have you seen? Is it family law issues, housing, criminal, employment, or other? I guess I'll send that back to you, Kelly, again.
Great. Thank you very much, Cecilia. We have a few people answering so far. And what is your, traditionally, what is your experience on this when you have asked this question at other presentations with direct service folks? Do you see mostly family law or mostly criminal law for women veterans?
Family law is a big, definitely. Family law is definitely a big issue among for women veterans. Not so much, haven't seen so much of the housing, and not so much in employment either, because there aren't that many nonprofit attorneys who actually provide employment services like Legal Aid Society Employment Law Center does. Although we see that there are a lot of women veterans with employment issues. And then a lot with these criminal law issues, even the ones with these minor traffic and parking tickets. So many of the veterans really have these small tickets that they never took care of, and that has snowballed into much bigger problems. So those are a lot of the other issues that we've seen. And another thing that we're seeing is that it's not just one issue, but it's multiple issues, and a lot of them impact other issues. For example, if you have an employment issue, so let's say you work for the VA, you were sexually harassed, and this has really impacted and negatively impacted your emotional health, and that really goes to your disability claim as well. So let's say you have a disability claim based on PTSD due to military sexual trauma. Well, now you've suffered additional trauma in a work environment, and those two are really connected and should be argued together. So we've seen a lot of interconnections with all of these different legal issues, and it often isn't just one problem, but many different problems working together.
Great answer. Thank you, Cecilia. And it looks like the results of the poll are in. We had 56%, as y'all can see, were family law issues. The lowest end of the scale was employment law issues at 11%, whereas then criminal law and then housing law issues was the big winner of the day. And do you think that goes to, Cecilia, the fact that most of the time you're talking about not just the woman veteran, but the woman veteran and her dependents, as to why housing law would be a bigger percentage of this? Well, all right then. We'll move on and maybe recap that question at the end of the presentation. Let's close the poll and we can move on to our presentation. Cecilia? Well, I think the technological bug has struck us again today. Is Elizabeth available?
Yes. Can you hear me, Kelly?
Panelist? I certainly can.
Great.
Everybody, I would like to introduce, continue on the presentation and introduce Elizabeth Kristen, whose bio you heard earlier in the introduction time. So if that works for you, Elizabeth, if we could move forward with the presentation.
Great. Thanks, Kelly, and thanks, Cecilia, for that great overview of our work. And, of course, we both want to thank Swords to Plowshares for this tremendous opportunity to have the privilege to work with women veterans for the last year on their legal issues. And the poll was interesting to me in that employment issues came in relatively low in this poll. What Cecilia and I have found over the past year is while often people think that employment issues aren't the most pressing need for women veterans, and they may not be the first item on someone's list when they come to see you. What we find is a lot of nonprofit providers don't even think to ask about employment issues because they have ideas, for example, that if someone is a homeless woman veteran, they aren't going to have employment issues because they think maybe they're not working. And what we have found is that that's actually not the case, that homeless women veterans may in fact be homeless because they lost their job. And so I want to talk a little bit about some of the legal issues that we've seen over the past year, and then also give folks a quick primer on some of the employment laws that have particular application to veterans and to women veterans, so that if you are working with women veterans, you can start looking for some of these issues. And our contact information will be on the last slide. And Cecilia and I are both more than happy to talk with you about clients that you might be working with or questions that you might have. But this might help people have some ability to spot some employment issues that they might have missed before, and that's our hope. So one of the issues that we found that was a large trend for us this year is that women who had been subjected to military sexual trauma while they were in the military would come out of the military, go into employment at, for example, the Veterans Administration, and then be subjected to sexual harassment at work. And that has been a huge problem. And I think because these women were particularly vulnerable because of their past experience, the sexual harassment was particularly difficult for them at work. These were women who were just trying to do their jobs, complained about the harassment, but instead of the harassment being solved, they were reprimanded, retaliated against, and ultimately terminated. And we worked with 3 women who were homeless as a result of having lost their jobs because of sexual harassment. So that was a big problem that we saw for women veterans in civilian employment. Another issue that people don't always know about is that there may be violations of disability laws, and sometimes these issues can overlap. So, for example, for our women veterans who had been subjected to sexual harassment, because they had some mental health conditions, they could have taken perhaps time off from work to recover from the harassment, or they could have had some accommodations at work, made some modifications, maybe a transfer to a different supervisor where they weren't being harassed. These kind of accommodations for disability were also sometimes people weren't aware that they had these rights. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. And then the final issue that I'm going to provide an overview about is this law called USERRA, which provides for really great reemployment rights for people who have to leave their jobs for military deployment, leave their civilian jobs. They're supposed to be able to come back to their jobs and basically pick up as if they had never left. And I think a lot of people don't know about this law. It's really powerful, really important, and it is really something that we want to have people have more awareness about. So just a few statistics that are going to be on the next slide about unemployment, and these will probably be familiar to you all, that the unemployment rate for women veterans is still quite high, 13.5%. It's higher than for non-veteran adult women, that 8% of homeless veterans are women. And we see higher rates of unemployment for young women veterans as well. And as I've talked a little bit about, there's a lot of barriers to finding and keeping a job. And what Cecilia mentioned was my experience as well, that these overlapping complicated legal problems are a huge barrier for women veterans, and that is a barrier to finding and keeping jobs as well. If you don't have stable housing, if you don't have access to a car, or you've lost your driver's license, or you don't have child care, or you have pressing family issues to attend to, it's really difficult to look for a job and keep a job. And so these are really interlocking serious problems. So I wanted to move on to my next section about disability laws and just provide a really brief overview of what these laws provide. There's a federal law that a lot of people probably have heard of called the Americans with Disabilities Act, but there's also a state law called the Fair Employment and Housing Act. They have a lot of similarities and a few differences that I'll point out. But basically, these laws not only prohibit discrimination against people with disabilities, they also require reasonable accommodation if the employee needs it. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what might be a qualifying disability under these laws, because it's a little bit different than what some other laws provide. And most private employers, all public employers, and most private employers are going to be covered by these laws. For federal coverage, the Americans with Disabilities Act, the employer has to have 15 or more employees. But for the state coverage, they only have to have 5 or more employees. And the state law also prohibits other kinds of discrimination, like sexual harassment, which we talked a little bit about. And for that, the employer only has to have 1 employee to be covered by sexual harassment law. So it's a very strong law, and yet we still have a lot of problems with it. So to move on to how you show a disability, a lot of times people don't know that they have a disability or that they have a disability as defined under the disability laws. It's a very broad definition. It's an impairment that substantially limits, or under state law limits, a major body activity, major bodily function or major life activity. And a lot of kinds of service-related disabilities like PTSD or depression or anxiety or traumatic brain injury are very likely to be covered disabilities. If you have a covered disability, you're entitled to not only not be discriminated against and also not be harassed on the basis of your disability, but you're also entitled to accommodations. And I'm going to talk first about leaves of absence as a reasonable accommodation. Leaves of absence, which is the next slide, is basically a time off from work that allows you to seek treatment or to recover from an illness so that you can then go back and do your job. Unlike another law that I'm going to talk about, the Family Medical Leave Act, there's not a specific limit on how much time off you can take. So if you're experiencing symptoms of PTSD that don't allow you to do your job temporarily and you need time off to go to treatment, you can take that time off if it's medically advisable in one chunk. You could take off a month, 2 months, 3 months. It's really important that if somebody is going to do that they also provide an estimated return to work date. Sometimes people say, or their doctors say, well, I don't know how long she's going to have to be out. You can't give your employer an open-ended return date. You have to say, I'm going to try and come back in 2 months. My doctor will reevaluate me then. So that's a really important point with respect to leaves of absence. And generally, these are going to be provided, the employer will be required to provide them unless there's some kind of an undue hardship. An undue hardship isn't just that the employer doesn't want to do it or doesn't think they can do it. It really has to be some big burden on the employer. Now, there are other kinds of reasonable accommodations other than leaves of absence, and if you have a client or you're working with somebody or you need help figuring out what other kinds of accommodations might allow you to stay at work and keep earning a paycheck while still getting treatment, we can talk more about that. But one example is if you need time off to go to therapy, your employer should give you that time off as a reasonable accommodation and allow you to, go for a couple hours a week and then come back to work. So that's the section that I wanted to talk a little bit about disability law. And now I'd like to move on a little bit to what USERRA provides. I'm going to get back to USERRA's other provisions, but USERRA also provides reasonable accommodation requirements, and it says that employers have to provide service members with reasonable accommodations. They have to also assist veterans during the application process, and they have to transfer an employee if they didn't qualify for their previous position. This is people coming back from service, if they don't qualify for their old position because of a disability. So USERRA has some additional specific protections. So I'd next like to move on to family medical leave laws. The Family Medical Leave Act is a really important and very protective federal law that provides for time off from work if you're eligible for this leave, and it requires job reinstatement. So the reason that it's so important, while it's unpaid leave, it allows you to take time off work and get your job back and also have health insurance continuation while you're out on leave. The eligibility requirements are there on the slide. There's nothing really intuitive about these. They're just something that you have to either memorize or you have to learn, or call me if you have questions. But basically, it's a relatively small number of people who are going to be eligible because you have to have had a year in service, 1,250 hours of work, and you have to work for a big enough employer. They have to have 50 or more employees within 75 miles. The next slide shows that you get 12 weeks of leave per year, except for the military caregiver leave, which provides 26 weeks of leave. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later because there are some new provisions of the FMLA that people don't always know about that provide some special protections that are relevant to veterans. The next slide talks about the rights that you have if you're eligible for family medical leave. The other acronym on there, CFRA, is our California equivalent, which is the California Family Rights Act. Again, it's very similar to the federal law, but there are some key differences that I'm not going to talk about today, but that may become relevant if you're dealing with leave for pregnancy in particular. The leave doesn't have to be taken all at once. It can be taken what's called intermittently. So the example I gave earlier about someone who needs a couple hours off a week to go to therapy, that's an example of something that could also be intermittent leave, meaning that you don't take it all at once. You don't take your full 12 weeks. The kind of leave under the FMLA that you take also requires the employer to continue your health insurance if you have it, which is very important. Employees are supposed to give notice of their need for FMLA 30 days ahead of time, or if they have an emergency, they're supposed to give notice as soon as they can, generally within 3 business days. Employee may be required to submit medical certification. Here in California, we have really strong privacy protections, and so the employer can't ask an employee for their medical diagnosis. A lot of employers make this mistake and use a form that maybe they use in another state, but in California they're not allowed to know about your diagnosis, which can be really important for women veterans who maybe don't want to disclose to their employer that they're dealing with depression or PTSD. So the reasons for taking FMLA is if you need time off to care for your own serious health condition. That's something that I've mentioned before. But you can also take time off to care for certain family members with serious health conditions. It's a relatively narrow definition of family. It includes spouse, and now under federal law also includes same-sex spouses. It includes parents and children. So it's really a small group of family members. You also can take leave to bond with a new child. That's a child who's born, adopted, or fostered into your home within the first year of the child's birth. And then there are these new provisions that I'm going to talk more about for military exigency leave and military caregiver leave. So the next slide talks about military exigency leave. This says that employees are entitled to take 12 weeks of leave per year for qualifying exigencies. And this is the foreign deployment of a spouse, a child, or a parent. And the next slide talks about what qualifying exigencies might be. These are things like short notice deployments, military events, child care, parental care, financial and legal arrangements, counseling, rest and recuperation, post-deployment, and my favorite, additional activities. So I think there's a lot of room there in the qualifying exigency leave for people to get some time off from work for a spouse, a parent, or a child who's in the military. The next slide talks about the military caregiver leave. This is a really important additional benefit in the FMLA, and it allows qualifying employees to take 26 weeks of leave per year to care for ill or injured service members. And this is basically the same narrow definition of family with the addition of this term next of kin. Next of kin actually has to be a blood relationship, but it is a slightly broader definition than under the FMLA. There are, as I explain on the next slide, there are some additional provisions under California law that provide for a different kind of leave, and this says that spouses of employees who are have spouses of service that are service members and work at least 20 hours a week for an employer that has 25 employees can have up to 10 days of unpaid leave per year when the service member is home from deployment. And again, you have to provide notice to the employer. I want to move next to the next slides, which talk about domestic violence and sexual assault in the workplace. This is an area that my office has worked on quite a bit, and this addresses the employment protections that are available for survivors of domestic violence or sexual assault or stalking. And the first provision that I'm going to talk about is time off to go to court. All employers in California are subject to this law. So if you have a client or survivor who needs time off to go to court to get a restraining order, they are entitled to take that time off and to get their job back and to not be retaliated against for taking that time off. We are developing, and we'll have on our website very soon, a toolkit for people who want to request that kind of leave and a toolkit for advocates to use with sample letters and sample certification forms. The next slide explains that there's also a law in California that allows you to take time off to get services because of domestic violence, sexual assault, or stalking. This is if you work for an employer with 25 or more employees, and it allows you to take time off to go to counseling, to go to see a rape crisis counselor, for example, if you need to change your locks or engage in safety planning. So this time off, again, you're supposed to be able to take the time off and then go back to work after the time off is over. You have to give notice, which the next slide explains, of your need for this leave. And this is the really tricky part. If the employer asks for proof that you're a survivor, you have to provide certain kinds of proof to the employer. They're supposed to keep it confidential. But this can be a barrier for some survivors who don't want to disclose to their employer that they were a domestic violence or sexual assault survivor. And then I'm very proud of the work that we accomplished this year that is shown on the next slide. We sponsored a bill last year in California, and it was signed into law and became effective this year. And so as of January 1, it's unlawful for an employer to terminate or discriminate against an employee based on known status as a victim of domestic violence, sexual assault, or stalking. What we were finding is that survivors were telling their employer that they were a survivor of domestic violence or sexual assault, and then the employer would say to them, you know what, we really can't have you bringing your personal problems to work, you're fired. And that was a loophole in the existing law. We had some good legal theories about why it should still be unlawful. But it wasn't clear to employers that they were violating the law by doing that. That's now clearly unlawful in California as of January 1. And even more exciting to me is that there's also now a requirement that employers provide safety accommodations to survivors. So if a survivor needs a minor modification at work so that they feel safer, for example, having their phone number changed or having their desk moved to a different location, that's something that employers are required to provide now unless there's an undue hardship. So I'm next going to move on to discrimination and harassment laws. This particular part of the presentation is focused on discrimination and harassment based on military or veteran status. This is another new law this year. The Fair Employment and Housing Act now makes it explicit that it's unlawful to discriminate against or harass an employee on the basis of military or veteran status. And there's some specific definitions there about who are the employees that are covered under the Fair Employment and Housing Act and then under that federal law that I mentioned before, USERRA. I'm going to talk a little bit more about USERRA. I've mentioned it a couple of times. This is a federal law that guarantees a veteran returning from military service or training the right to be reemployed at their former job. It applies to employers regardless of the number of employees. Now, the trick is that the absence can't exceed a cumulative amount of 5 years, but it's basically a very protective law. Now, there are, again, some other restrictions, no guarantee of reemployment if you're separated from service under other than honorable conditions or in situations involving a court-martial. And so there are some restrictions. But basically, the other important part of USERRA is explained on the next slide, which is that depending on how long you were away, the employer, when you come back, has to have a good reason for firing you. In general, employees are subject to what's called at-will employment, which means that they can be fired at any time for any reason. But this USERRA provision changes at-will into for cause, which means that the employer has to have a good reason. That's not just an arbitrary reason for termination for a certain period of time after the service member returns to work. This is another reminder on the next slide about coverage. The Fair Employment and Housing Act covers employers with 5 or more employees for discrimination, 1 or more for harassment. If their law has been violated, the procedure is to file with the State Department of Fair Employment and Housing within 1 year. But if you have a client or you yourself have a claim of discrimination or harassment, I'd be very pleased to talk with you and walk you through the process because there's more detail than I've provided here. And then USERRA, that you file with the United States Department of Labor, but there's no statute of limitations on a USERRA claim. There's, on the next slide, there's some additional California law in the Military and Veteran Code that provides some additional job-protected leave. Again, that's 17 days a year for certain kinds of training, and private and public employees can't terminate employees or make adverse employment decisions against them for performing ordered military duties. The next slide talks about California public employees and says that public employees maintain their benefits while they're away on a military leave and that they receive certain kinds of sick and vacation time as if they had never been away from their job, and that there are some ways in which you can count your military service towards your service with the public agency. So that's all the prepared slides that we have. I understand, I've been trying not to look because I've been trying not to get distracted, but I understand some questions came in during this presentation. So I'm sure we'll have some time for questions, and I'll let Kelly manage those.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth, and thank you, Cecilia. Those were both informative, really kind of jam-packed informationally wise presentations. And we do have several questions. We'd like to start off with the first question we had is regarding the numbers that you presented for the unemployment rates for women veterans, such as 8% were homeless, etc. We were just wondering what the source of those numbers, what was the source for those numbers, and if you don't know that off the top of your head, I'm sure you'll be able to find out and get that back to us. But do you know that off the top of your head?
I know some of them. The source for the unemployment numbers was from the Department of Labor, the Bureau of Labor Statistics. The homeless numbers I don't have off the top of my head. Cecilia, I don't know if you do.
I think we're having technical issues with Cecilia's voice.
Okay, well, we'll be sure to get that information emailed out to people.
Okay, great. Thank you. I think the next question we wanted to ask was, when it comes to the confidentiality of leaves of absence related to PTSD and or MST, what if you don't want your employers to know you have the condition, you want to keep that private? I know you did indicate that in the state of California, the employers are not allowed to ask about medical diagnosis, so therefore protects the person's privacy in that regard. And kind of talk about that, and then what happens if an employer wrongly asked about a diagnosis in a state that doesn't allow it? What actions can be taken from that?
Yeah, that's a great question. The California privacy protections come from our California Constitution, so they're very strong protections. The Americans with Disabilities Act also does provide some protection against unlawful medical inquiries. So it depends on why someone is asking about your diagnosis. If you are just a veteran and you're at work and your employer comes to you and said, hey, I know you're a veteran. Maybe you have PTSD like those other veterans I see on television. Tell me about your PTSD. That could be an unlawful medical inquiry under the Americans with Disabilities Act because they have no lawful employment-related reason to know anything about your medical condition. It also could be considered discrimination or harassment on the basis of military or veteran status. And then it also potentially could be a violation of the California Constitution. So there's a lot of ways in which privacy is protected. But once you have a reason to talk to your employer about needing time off because of your condition, it gets a little more complicated. So if you need time off and you're covered by the Family and Medical Leave Act and you're here in California, the employer doesn't get to know about your diagnosis. But they do get to know some medical information. They get to know that you have a serious health condition. They get to know how much time off that you're going to take. And so they do get a little bit more information under the Family and Medical Leave Act. Now, if you're not eligible for family medical leave, maybe your employer is not big enough, or maybe you used up all of your 12 weeks in that year of family medical leave, and you're taking time off or asking for a modification because of your disability, they can ask for some limited information. Now, they still can't ask for the diagnosis, but they can ask for the effective limitations that your condition imposes. So they could get a note from your doctor that says, for example, my patient is experiencing these kinds of limitations and therefore needs time off from work. And so the line gets a little blurry there between once they say all of the limitations or some of the limitations you experience, it gets closer to revealing a diagnosis. And so it can be really difficult once your employer starts asking for medical documentation. They often will overreach and ask for your entire medical file or access to your doctor so that they can call them up. And generally, we want to keep that as absolutely narrow as possible. We're more than happy to work with people and try and work with doctors to write the narrowest notes that they have to. And we have a number of samples on our website, sample requests for accommodation, to sort of limit and cabin that information.
Well, that's great. Thank you for that answer. I think the next question I'd like to ask is kind of along the same lines, but specifically for domestic violence survivors who take that time off that you talked about. Can the employer enforce the time off unpaid? Is there ever a situation where that's allowed?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on the employer and it depends on the reason for the leave. Now, if you're taking time off because you have medical reasons to take off, you may be able to use your sick time, for example, or you may be able to use your vacation time. But if you don't have that time off or if your employer doesn't allow you to use it, generally they can have you take unpaid time off. But it would really depend on the circumstances. So if you have a particular situation that you're thinking of and you want to call me or email me, I'd be more than happy to talk it through with you.
That's a great resource. Excellent resource. Thank you. The last question that we had relates to Cecilia's portion of the presentation. I'm hoping that either you can field it or we can agree to kind of gather the information and present it later. But it has to do with MST and PTSD claims, how they're handled when the reporting of the sexual assault is of a restricted nature.
Yes, so I understand that when you make a report, you can make a restricted report or an unrestricted report. I don't know how it affects when you're making you're talking about a claim for benefits later, it sounds like. And I would think that regardless of whether it's restricted or unrestricted, it should be sufficient evidence that the MST occurred to support a claim. But if Cecilia has more to add on that, we can email that after.
That would be great. Thank you very much. I think at this time we've pretty much covered all the questions that have come in during this presentation, these very informative presentations. And I want to thank Cecilia, Elizabeth, the folks at Swords to Plowshares for putting this together and on, and to you, our participants. Thank you very much for your attendance, and please note that each of you will be prompted once you exit the webinar to complete a brief survey to evaluate our presentation. And your feedback is very important to us and is greatly appreciated. Thank you again for your time. This concludes our webinar. You may now disconnect.